I wrote about abortion in 2018, and I want to just share the first 3 paragraphs of that piece, and I'll link to it. Sure. And this was when Justice Kennedy had just announced retirement, and before Kavanaugh had ascended to the bench. I didn't know if ascended was the right word. I was trying to avoid the word ascended.
I think it is physically elevated, so we can justify ascended.
Okay. And of course, at that point, there was a lot of discussion about what that might mean for Roe. And so you can show my screen if you like, Zach. Like I say, I will also post this. Oh, yeah, no, it's plugged in.
Just go ahead and read.
So this was published on August 24th, 2018 in Aereo. And here are the first 3 paragraphs. Nobody wants an abortion. No woman wants one, and no man who has thought about the issue wants any woman he cares about to be in a position in which she feels compelled to have one. Sometimes, though, in the service of the greater good, abortions are necessary. In the wake of the announcement of American Supreme Court Justice Kennedy's imminent retirement, the issue of abortion once again became central in many news feeds. It is a topic perennially guaranteed to provoke outrage, all the more politically useful now that former hot-button topics like gay marriage and the legalization of marijuana have slid out of the maelstrom. In Slate recently, William Salatan argued that, quote, most Americans are conflicted about abortion. They don't like it, but they also don't like the idea of banning it, end quote. This argument is backed up by poll numbers, but the position itself is not, contrary to what Salatan suggests, a conflicted one. Believing abortion necessary while not liking it is internally consistent and both nuanced and moral. I have friends who have had abortions. Most people probably do, whether they know it or not. One of my friends escaped an abusive home, became addicted to heroin, and got pregnant very young, before aborting the fetus, getting her act together, and becoming a scientist. That part where she got her act together and became a scientist, far less likely had she been a teenage mother. So I explore a lot in this piece, and I really would hope for us to be able to show my screen. The point, and Alito actually writes this in the very opening paragraph of his opinion as well, is he talks about the 3 groups. He says, you've got a group of Americans who think that abortion is always wrong no matter what the circumstances. You have a group of Americans who think that abortion should be allowed under any circumstances. And you have a third group, and the way he writes it, it almost seems like an afterthought, maybe a fringe group, maybe a tiny group, who thinks that abortion should be allowed but with limits. And what the Gallup numbers reveal, and what, frankly, you think it's showing now?
I can.
Yeah, great. What these Gallup numbers show, great, is that the majority, actually it's not quite the majority at this point, of Americans, about half of Americans feel that abortion should be legal, and the wording here is only under certain circumstances. So as of 2021, the last year for which data are available under the Gallup polls, you have 19% believing that abortion should be illegal in all circumstances, 32% believing that it should be legal under any circumstances, and 48% believing that abortion should be legal only under certain circumstances. And I don't have access, or I didn't find time to figure out what the wording exactly was. But I suspect actually that those 2 groups of legal under all circumstances and legal only under certain circumstances would change a little bit if the language was something like under any circumstances, but not in the 3rd trimester unless the life of the mother or the child are at risk.
Right.
And frankly, that right there, which I hadn't thought of before, but which is a framing that many, many, many people have used, is frankly where, and, should it be the end of the 3rd trimester? Should it be in the 1st trimester? Should it be halfway through the 2nd trimester? There's a lot of gray area there, a lot of wiggle room there, but, no elective abortions in the 3rd trimester is me having that as my strongly held belief that I have had forever. Even when I had a much less nuanced approach to this issue in other ways, would put me in this legal only under certain circumstances category, which fully half of Americans put themselves in. Most people, if you really ask them carefully, do not actually think that elective abortion the day before a woman is due to give birth is okay, right?
So This is reflective of the same dynamic that the Hidden Tribes report found across almost everything,
Yes.
right? Is that there is this vast middle ground that more or less agrees within, a standard nuance or two,
Yeah.
about most of the issues that supposedly we can't come to agreement about. And what's happening is that these fringes are bossing us around. They are causing us to understand these as unresolvable issues. Now, Roe itself contains this nuance.
Yes.
Right?
It has the language around viability, right? Or is it I don't remember. It's trimesters or viability.
I think it was viability, and then it's modified by later decision. But nonetheless, the point is, and I think one of the things that we should do is we should stop thinking of it in terms of fine until X, because that causes the brain to hang up. That's not really what's going on. What's going on is the earlier you go in pregnancy, the fewer moral issues exist there at all. And at the point that you're talking about, an unimplanted cluster of cells, right, there's really only one argument against it, maybe one and a half, and it's a religious argument, which I don't think is a necessarily bad argument. People are entitled to have their own philosophical relationship with the universe. And to the extent that they feel like, hey, you know what, that was going to be a human being, and who gave you the right to say it doesn't get to be one? I don't think people who hold that unusual position are in a place to tell the rest of us how to think about it. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, I don't think that they are saying something insane. I think that it never goes to zero for me.
Yeah, if they are, there are people, and it is a small minority, who have strongly held consistent, non-hypocritical positions with regard to the sanctity of human life. And I will add human there because these are not people who believe in the sanctity of life. Such people do exist. Right? Is it the Jains? No, it's there's some group in some religious group that really tries not to tread on anything at all. But of course, we're still eating live things, things that we have killed to eat them. So it's just simply impossible to try to preserve absolutely all life if you are yourself alive. So sanctity of human life believers who are consistent on abortion and on the death penalty, for instance, are that is a position that is not one that I agree with, but is well formed and arrived at honestly. And I would hope that such people do not end up making policy that the rest of us have to live under. But there it is. There is a lot of hypocrisy in a lot of the positions that people have with regard to abortion. And, as I also say in this piece, a couple of things, actually. One is that it is estimated that a majority of human pregnancies miscarry before the woman even knows she's pregnant. And so the fact of first trimester miscarriages, that is when the body decides, or abortions when the individual decides on behalf of the body, are common, and miscarriages are in fact so common, in part because a lot of combinations of gametes of egg and sperm just aren't viable. There's some problem. Early development is a fragile and difficult process. Early in pregnancy is when exposure to any kinds of toxins are particularly damaging to the fetus, and this is why morning sickness, this is why food aversions tend to be concentrated early in pregnancy in that first trimester. There's a whole lot of insult and injury that can happen to a fetus, wanted or not, that the fetus being wanted or not, that can cause it to miscarry, to self-abort. And so the earlier in a pregnancy that an abortion happens, the less moral quandary we should find ourselves in. But your point is, it's not a black and white line, right? And in fact, I again make this argument too. There are a couple of lines that we can point to, right? In pregnancy, there's and in the beginning of human life, there is birth, inside or outside the mom's body, and there is conception. Have the sperm and egg met or have they not? And those two lines are the ones that people at those two extremes seem to be fighting over. And many of us, and I think it's actually most of us, are saying, actually, those two hard and fast lines, their only virtues are that they are hard and fast and you can point to them.
They are non-arbitrary in one way and only
in one way. You can point to it and you can say, yes, inside the mother's body or outside, born or not. Yes. Egg and sperm have met or they have not. And, there are some others implanted in the uterine wall, all of this, but those are the two that are easiest to point to. And neither of them, I posit, is the right line to draw any kind of border at with regard to abortion rights.
And I would point out also that a mature discussion, and I am not under the impression that civilization at large is about to have a mature discussion about this, but the fact is, for people in subsistence circumstances, ancestors who did not live in a technological society, but were subject to the whims of nature with respect to how much resource it was going to deliver, right? The question of humanness and what happens to an individual doesn't necessarily get settled at birth either. In other words, infanticide is something that occurs in circumstances. It's not even just in humans, right? We see it in other animals. And the point is the fluctuations in the environment mean that the physiological decision to conceive, right, is made in one circumstance, and that circumstance can change, right? Or that's not the only way that this happens. But the point is, we live in a prosperous civilization. We are perfectly well equipped to say, you know what? We can solve this dicey issue. And we can say, we can all agree that at the point you are born, you are deserving of the protections of a human being. And we can ask whether those protections extend backwards before you were born, because we can recognize the absurdity of imagining that there is something magical about the instant at which you transition, right? And even questions of something like...
It's a tough word there.
Right. Even questions of something like viability are absurd if you scrutinize them from a biological perspective, because the fact is human beings are so utterly helpless at birth that the fact that they transition to outside of the womb and they start taking in resources through their mouth rather than their umbilical cord is itself in a way arbitrary, right? Selection has made human offspring utterly dependent on adult care for many years after they are born. So
we remain the most altricial and is the most helpless and dependent on the adults who love us for so long,
for the longest period,
right? Of any organisms that we know of,
right? So in any case, the point is, I actually think that if we were to do this philosophically, rather than with all of our amygdalas activated and, fighting the next civil war here, if we were to do this properly, we would recognize that the moral and ethical considerations actually don't even start at conception, right? There's a question about, what do we think about whether or not it's cool to potentially impregnate somebody that you wouldn't want to have anything to do with if it made them pregnant, right? Having sex with somebody who you have no intention of partnering with, should you be allowed to do that? I think so. Is it a good idea? I don't think so. But what are we to do? Is there zero moral content in that question? I don't think so. I think that there is a question that starts even before conception, that conception, is, as you point out, has one virtue as a starting point for the discussion, which is that it's non-arbitrary, right? And birth has that same virtue. It's non-arbitrary. But really the fact is, what you've got is kind of, an asymptote towards birth, where we reach a place where we all agree, no, this isn't your choice. And we have, a kind of power law tail of the distribution over at conception, where it's like, well, actually, there's some question about, how we're supposed to be interacting with each other sexually anyway. And, the basic point is, we kind of all agree, not necessarily on how we feel about, a particular point in the developmental trajectory, but we all agree, with the exception of these fringes that push us around, we all agree on the idea that there's some question that gets more and more precipitous the longer this fetus has been gestating. And the crazy part is that given that given that the largest group of us agree on that this is a function, right, that gets the moral content becomes more concentrated and important the later in the process we're talking about, we should be able to navigate this and say, well, okay, what do we collectively think? At what point do enough of us agree that that this is a being deserving of protections, that, you know, we can rule it out beyond this point? What do we do with the fact that we may say, this, you know, fetus has gotten to a point where we believe it deserves protections, but the mother also deserves protections, right? These are questions that can be navigated.